to our show, A Can of Bookworms. If you're new here, my name is Sarah.
And my name is Victoria.
And we offer a deep dive storytelling experience for books in the YA, fiction, and fantasy genres.
And if you guys aren't into spoilers, I'm sorry, but this probably isn't the show for you, so you might want to bow out now, because we're going to leave no stone unturned when it comes to these books, so we're going to get really in-depth, so if you don't really want to know everything, then, yeah.
Toodaloo.
Bye. We'll see you never.
Yes.
But, sorry. But if you decide you do want to see it, like, spoilers later, you know, you can come back. And then today we're going to be doing Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. Put it up there so you guys can see it. So this book is also just a newly adapted TV series as well. It's on Apple TV. I haven't seen it. I just read the book because, you know, I'm not a big fan of TV adaptations. I mean, unless they do a good job, you know. Like
Well, it's really hard for them to do a good job. Like, let's be real. I feel like most of the times it's kind of
I feel like it's good for the people that didn't read the book.
That's true.
I feel like people that didn't read the book usually love it. And then the people who read the book are like, I don't know. And I also feel like they should, you know, let us decide which characters they cast. Like, they
100%.
should do, like, a vote first.
Yes.
And then
voting.
Then I would probably be okay with it. But I'd be like, okay, because, you know, it's like, even if I didn't win, at least I know that, like, we had a choice, you know?
Yes.
But, you know, it's not the perfect world that we all want to live in. But one day, maybe, they'll care about what we think. But, so, just so you guys know, there are going to be some trigger warnings in this book. So, there is some SA in this book and also some self-exiting in this book. So, if you're not in a place where you want to listen to stuff like that, I totally get it. Just stop listening now.
Go cuddle with your dog, take a bath, eat some good snacks.
Yeah. But for everybody else, so this book, I'm trying to make it as, like, understanding as possible, but it is still in third person, so there's, like, so many different perspectives. Even the dog has a perspective in this book, so I'm, like, jammering on a little bit about, like, what they're thinking. It's just because there's so many different viewpoints going on at the same time, and they're all really important to the overall story. So, yeah, so just bear with me. It'll all make sense in the end, I hope. But we'll see. So, this book takes place in the 1950s to early 1960s.
Okay.
So women lived very different lives back then than where we live now. Even though women got the right to vote in the 1920s, they still had a long ways to go in the 1950s and 60s. Women still weren't able to do a lot of things, and also just, like, culturally, women weren't supposed to do a lot of things. Yeah. And it's even down to the point where, like, women couldn't really open their own bank accounts unless their husbands were present. Yeah.
So if you're, like, unmarried or, like, single, like, are you, like, screwed? Do you just keep all your mattress, like, do you keep all your money under the mattress?
Yeah, I really don't know. It doesn't even make sense. Like, what do you mean? Like, us, you know, direct deposit, and, like, we take our paycheck in. Like, do they just pay women in cash? Like, I don't understand. Like, how would that even work? And they're not allowed to own property either. They're not allowed to own their own property. And they're also not allowed to, like, co-sign on, like, wills or anything. So, like, if they have a will, they can't even, like, you know, it's crazy. They're not allowed to do a whole bunch of stuff. And a women's place back then was mostly at home. Women weren't really in the workforce like they are today. And if they were kind of, like, typecasted in these, like, job roles where they could be, like, a secretary, or they could be, like, a teacher or a nurse. But anything besides that, it was very uncommon for women to be in that work environment. And if they were usually belittled. They were paid probably less than half of what a man would make in the same position. So even though they were, like, slowly making their way into progress, it still was nowhere near where it should be. So just a little bit of background so you guys know, like, what you're getting yourselves into, get in the mindset of the 1950s and 60s. So our book starts off with Elizabeth Zott. Elizabeth Zott is a chemist. She works at Hastings Research Institute, and so she She went to school for chemistry. That's like her passion.
So that's not very common either, right?
No.
We're talking about that.
Not at all.
Most women would not be in that kind of field at all.
Yeah, so she is the only person who works as a chemist in her job. There are other women. Yeah, there are other women that work there, but they're more, like I said, like in the secretary roles or stuff like that. There's no women that are actual chemists at this research institute except for Elizabeth. So she works at the research institute. She loves chemistry. It's like she eats, sleeps, breathes it. She wants to be a chemist. That's all she really wants in life. She doesn't want kids.
Sorry.
Yeah, I know too.
I hated chemistry in school.
Chemistry's not my favorite subject, but yeah.
Like, good for her. Good for her.
Good for her. You know, I mean, it's got to say that she's got to, you know, probably, she's a lot smarter than me, for sure. And that's also kind of her thing, is she's super smart. Everybody's intimidated by her, or they just don't understand her because they're just like, oh, you're a woman. You don't actually know what you're talking about. But she's very strong-willed, and she has a daughter. Her daughter is Madeline. Madeline is 5 years old, and Madeline isn't your typical 5-year-old, so Madeline's been reading since the age of 3,
Wow.
and she's read through most of Dickens' novels by the time she was 5.
I don't even think I've read a Dickens novel.
Yeah, I haven't either. I know, reading that book, I'm like, man, should I go pick one up? Like, am I not as intelligent? But anyways,
The 5-year-old?
am I not as intelligent as this 5-year-old in this book I'm reading? Probably not. So she has a really hard time in school because she is very advanced for her age. She's still reading, and she's reading really intellectual books. She's not reading like Dr. Seuss or anything like that.
She's missing out.
Yeah. So she really sticks out as a sore thumb at her school, and she has a really hard time making friends. So Madeline really tries to act normal as best as she can. So she tries to hide her intellect and how smart she is. She tries to act like a regular kid, but unfortunately still doesn't really work that well. She still doesn't really have any friends. But Madeline's main goal is to not end up like her mom, because her mom, in her opinion, is terminally depressed. So, yeah, well, so Elizabeth makes her meals every day, and so her lunches aren't exactly like our lunches that we would get growing up. So she gets like full course meals. She probably has some apple juice in there for sure, but she gets like full course meals. Like one of Madeline's lunches would be like a slice of lasagna, so kiwis cut into like fourths. She's got cherry tomatoes. She's got a thermos of milk and 2 still warm chocolate chip cookies, along with a little salt shaker to salt her food.
She eats better than I do.
Yeah, and her mom also leaves little notes in her lunchbox every day, but they're not the typical types of notes that you would think that would be in a child's lunchbox. Like, you know, like, do your best, you know? Like, try your hardest. Have a good day.
You're
like,
amazing.
I love you, you know? Elizabeth wrote stuff like, don't let the boys win at sports. Like, just don't automatically let the boys win. And then also,
Crush them all.
yeah. And then another one of them, which was my favorite, she said, if you're wondering why it's not your imagination, everybody actually is terrible. Yeah, so.
What? I thought we were supposed to teach kids that life is sunshine and rainbows at that age.
Not Madeline. That's not how Madeline was raised.
Maybe this is why she's worried about her mom.
Yeah, because she's giving her notes like that. She's like, dang, Mom. Like,
she's like, you think the world is awful now, honey? Well, guess what? It is. It's not going to get better.
She's like, just wait until you reach my age. Madeline starts losing weight, and Elizabeth gets really confused because Elizabeth also not only cooks her these great meals, Elizabeth being a chemist, she actually sits down and calculates how much calorie intake her daughter is supposed to get, like, per day. And down to, like, the protein source, the amino acids, like, everything that she's supposed to get to be a functioning 5-year-old girl.
I don't even do that for myself. I feel like I'm just, like, hearing all this, I'm like, man, I need to get my life together.
Yeah. So she literally is so confused. She's like, why is Madeline losing weight? Like, I don't get it. And her, with her scientist brain, she's like, okay, is she have an eating disorder? And then she's like, okay, 5 years old's a little young to start with an eating disorder. And then she's like, okay, well, maybe she has leukemia. Maybe there's something wrong with her. Maybe she has an illness. So she's freaking out. She can't figure out what's going on. And then finally, she figures it out. So it turns out Madeline was actually giving her food to one of her classmates in exchange for friendship. Yeah, so this little girl sees that Elizabeth...
bullying to me.
Yeah, sees that Elizabeth is getting, like, this lasagna, all this crazy stuff. She's got, like, you know, half of a sandwich, and she's just like, this girl. She ain't got no friends. I know exactly how I'm going to get these meals. So she starts taking Elizabeth's food to the point where Madeline. To the point where Madeline starts losing weight, and it's noticeable. So Elizabeth, of course, is infuriated.
Is she not even, like, trading? Like, it's like, okay, I'll give you, like, my peanut butter and jelly for your lasagna. Like, is there...
Nope, she's just skipping her entire meal, and the other girl's eating it. Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, you're right, bullying.
Kids are terrible.
Yeah, they are. So Elizabeth gets infuriated. She's like, can't believe this little girl is stealing my daughter's food. This is ridiculous. Mm-hmm. So she calls the girl's dad. She calls him like 3-4 times, never hears back from him. And so she just goes straight into his office. And she walks...
How did she find out where he works?
She called the school.
Okay. I feel like nowadays they don't give any information out at all.
Yeah, but back in the
here's his address, here's his workplace, you want everything, here's his mother's maiden name.
Back in the 1960s, they didn't care so much about that stuff. They weren't worried about someone kidnapped. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it happened, but that's why we have those rules now. But back in the day, I don't think anybody really cared. They were just like, yeah, whatever, yeah, give your information. And so she tramps down to his office, blows right past the secretary, blows right past the stuff. He works at a TV production place, and so she goes into his office, and he's just like totally taken aback, like, what the heck is going on? And she's like, are you Walter Pine? And he's like, yes, I'm Walter Pine. And she's like, your daughter has been stealing my daughter's lunch under false pretenses. She's been stealing my daughter's lunch in exchange for friendship. And she's like, you need to make sure that your daughter does not do this anymore. You need to make sure that your daughter is getting the proper nutrition and make sure that she's getting her food and that she stops stealing my daughter's food. And he's just like so confused. He's not even listening to what she's saying because the first thing he notices is how, I forgot to mention, Elizabeth is drop dead gorgeous.
Of course.
So he's just staring at her and he's like, what is this? And he's just like, what is this beautiful woman doing in my office? And he just starts looking at her like beautiful, like buttery toast hair that she has put on top of her head with a number 2 pencil, and she's got like this perfect nose, and she's strikingly beautiful.
How old is she?
She's 30 years old. Yeah.
So goals.
Yeah, literally. And so he's just like totally has no idea what's going on. He's like, just so you know, all of the nursing roles were already casted for today. We don't have any more roles available. He thinks she's there to be an extra. And she's like, what? She's like, Amanda Pine, your daughter. And he's like, what? What about my daughter? Is she okay? Like, are you from the school? Are you a doctor? Is something going on? And she's like, no, sir, I'm here because your daughter is stealing my daughter's lunch. And he's like, oh, what? And he's still just like so confused, like barely even paying attention. He's just so distracted by how pretty she is. He's just has no idea what's going on.
Typical man.
Yeah. And he's like, well, I'm recently divorced. And she's like, men can make lunch too. It's not biologically impossible. And he's like, oh, I know. I'm sorry. I didn't mean that. And then she goes into this whole rant. She's just like, look, I cannot afford to make your daughter lunch every day, and I do not have the time or the resources to make lunch for your daughter and my daughter, so you need to figure this out. And then she's like, I would love to sit down and teach the whole nation how to make a meal that matters, but nobody has time for that. And then she turns around to leave, and Walter's like, no, wait. And she's like, what? He's like, what did you say? What did you say about making food that matters?
He's like, light bulb!
And then he comes to Elizabeth with his proposal to start a TV show. He wants her to be a cook on his show and teach everybody how to make good food. And she's like, no. Like, why would I do that? Like, I'm a research chemist. Like, I don't want to be some show TV personality. Like, That's not me. And he's like, no, you have to do it. And then, of course, while we all take jobs, She did it because it pays way more than she ever would have got at the Hastings Research Institute, because as a woman, she makes less than half of what a man would make as a chemist. So she's like, okay, I'll do it. Fine. He convinces her. So she does it, and then Elizabeth is a sensation. Everybody loves her. So the whole nation is obsessed with her. And Elizabeth isn't exactly what you would think for a cooking show. You know, usually at cooking shows, they like
She's
tell
not Vanna White.
jokes. Yeah. She's not a cook show host though. She's like a TV
I know,
host.
but you know, like Jeopardy. I don't know.
Yeah,
That's who I think of when I think of.
She'd be more like Martha Stewart.
Okay.
Yeah, so her cooking show is unlike anybody else's cooking show. She's not like telling jokes. She doesn't have any guests. She doesn't have anything like that. She's literally just straight down to the facts. So she tells no jokes. She's like super monotone the whole time, and she's just telling you the ingredients, how to make the stuff, and everybody loves her. Like when she tells you to do something, like you sit down and you listen, and she becomes so popular. Within 6 months, her views are like off the charts, and then within two years, she is a nationwide success.
For the driest cooking show ever?
Yep, everybody loves Elizabeth Zott, and they cannot get enough of it. But
What's the cooking show called?
it's called Separate Six.
Separate Six.
Yeah, that's what the TV show is called. And so Elizabeth becomes a sensation. Everybody loves her, but Elizabeth is miserable. She really wants to be a chemist. She doesn't want to be a TV show host. She doesn't want to cook in front of everybody. Like, she doesn't want to be famous. And she also starts getting, like, you know, people start writing stuff about her in the papers. And because she's so attractive, they start saying all these crazy things about her. And one writer in particular calls her Luscious Lizzie, and it sticks. And so that ends up being her nickname that people call her. Is Luscious Lizzie. Yeah, and so Elizabeth is just miserable. She hates it. She just wants to be taken seriously as a chemist. She never wanted to be a cook. So most of the night she just stays up all night thinking about how her life came to this point. And finally, she comes to the realization that one person is responsible for all of these things that has happened. And his name is Calvin Evans.
Calvin Evans. I also feel like because of her field being so like stereotypically against women, that also I wonder if she feels sad that her being on the TV show also like ruins her like chances of being in her field because like of her reputation. It's like, oh, you're that cooking lady. You want to come and do chemistry? That's a joke.
Yeah, exactly. That's all she wants to do is to be taken seriously as a person. And, you know, not just as a woman, but just like a human being. Like, she wants her work to be represented and she wants people to take her seriously. And so she's just miserable. But yeah, so she thinks Calvin Evans, it's all his fault. So then we turn back time. It's now 1951. And she's working at Hastings Research Institute again.
How many years back is this?
10 years.
Okay, 10 years back.
Yeah, 10 years back. We go to Calvin Evans. So Calvin Evans is this guy. So he also is a lot like Elizabeth in the fact that he's just super smart. He's like genius level smart. And he has been a chemist for a really long time. He has his PhD in chemistry, and he went to Cambridge University, and he's a kind of a weird dude. He's not that attractive. He's got, like, dirty blonde hair, gray eyes. He's got, like, purplish lips because he always chews on them. But he has, like, this amazing smile, and when he smiles, it just, like, illuminates his whole face.
With the purple lips?
With his purple lips, yeah. But he is so just like an introverted person that a lot of people just think of him as like this rude, standoffish guy. So kind of like a Sheldon Cooper of like, you know, the chemistry world. And so Elizabeth is working at the Institute and she needs beakers because she hasn't been getting the right supplies for months. And so she storms directly into Calvin's office and she goes right past the signs to say, like, do not enter, lab in progress, like, all this stuff. She just goes right in. And she goes in and Calvin is, like, blaring Frank Sinatra and
the Rat Pack.
Yeah, and he's just like working, doing his thing, and then he looks up and he's like, what are you doing here? And she's like, oh, I'm here for beakers. Like, I'm here to take some of your beakers. And she's like, here, I have this order from the inventory management that I can take your beakers. And he's like, what? No, you can't have my beakers. Like, those are, I have a certain amount of beakers. You can't have them. And she's like, yes, I can. The inventory management says I can. And he's like, look, who are you here for? Like, let me talk to a chemist down there. Maybe I can explain to them that you can't have my beakers.
Excuse me?
And then she's like, wait, so you want to talk to somebody other than me? A chemist? Someone other than me? And he's like, yeah. He's like, sorry, I know it might be hard for you to understand. They really shouldn't send the secretaries down here to do their dirty work, but I'm very busy. And so she literally just marches over, grabs a whole box full of beakers.
You go, girl.
And she's like, what a coincidence. I'm busy too. And she just storms out. So she goes back to her lab and she is, business as usual. And it takes a whole week for Calvin to find out who she is and where she's from. And because this
She's not a secretary?
Yeah, because this institute has like so many people. And yeah, that's probably it too, because he's also looking for a secretary.
It's like, not that secretary, not this one.
He's like, nope, none of these he's like going through all the secretaries in the office because he never got her name. Mm-hmm. So he's just like, he can't figure out who she is. So he shows up to her office and she just is like busy. She's got like goggles on. She's got these huge like yellow like gloves.
Like Dexter.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's what I envisioned, but
Dexter's laboratory.
Yeah, Dexter's laboratory. Yeah, I don't think she's killing anyone.
She could be by the end of this book. Spoiler alert.
No. So she's busy. She's got these huge goggles on. She's literally doing an experiment, and Calvin walks in. And he's like, hey, it's me. And she's like, who? And he's like, me? The one that you took the beakers from? And she's like, well, I'm busy. And then she makes him wait there. So she finishes her experiment. She finishes her experiment. She reviews all of her old notes. She even goes to the bathroom. And she comes back and she's like, oh,
she really took her time.
Yeah. She comes back and she's like, oh, you're still here? And he's like, yeah, I'm still here. And she's like, hey, about the other day, I just wanted to come and apologize. And she's like, oh, you mean when you called me a secretary? And then he's like, oh, so you do remember me. And she's like, yeah, I remember you. And he's like, well, why want to make it up to you? What if we go get dinner or coffee or lunch? And she's like, you know what? You're really starting to annoy me. And he's just like, oh, I'm so sorry. I'll just leave then. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean anything by it. And then he leaves. And then the whole lab starts talking. And they're like, what was Calvin Evans doing here? Everybody starts freaking out. They're like, what? Why was he here? So Calvin actually is one of the top research chemists in the entire building.
So he's like a top dog.
He's the top dog. And the lab that she entered was his own private lab. And he's a big deal. So he is such a pronounced research chemist. He's been in Chemistry Today. He's been in so many different things. He was on the team that helped someone win the Nobel Prize. Like, he's a big deal. He's published like over 20 papers in chemistry magazines. Like, he's a big deal. He's the reason that this research institute even gets any funding.
Really?
Yeah. So everybody is freaking out. They're like, why was he here? And then they put it together. They're like, is that where you got the box of beakers from? Did you get those beakers from Calvin Evans? And she's just like, what's a big deal? Yeah, I got his beakers. Like, who cares? Whatever. And they are all freaking out. Like, they are so upset. And she actually ends up getting demoted for it. Yeah. But he came and apologized to her. So they're just so scared of this guy that he can ruin all of them, that even the association of her doing something that he would get upset about, they don't want anything to do with it. They are so mad at her. So they actually demote her. What? So they take her off of her study and put her on a simpler study. They said it's more to her like intellectual capabilities. She's going into the break room, and she hears everybody talking about her. And they're all talking about her, and they're like, Elizabeth just thinks that she's better than everybody else. She oversteps her boundaries, and, like, they're basically just fed up. They think that she's just, like, the worst. They're like, she's not even that smart. She's not even good at her job. I don't know why she's here. They're just over it. And then one of her coworkers actually calls her, see you next Tuesday. Yeah, so they actually call her that, which, in my opinion, is one of the most derogatory terms you can call a woman. So,
did she confront them about them talking to her, or did she just... I mean, I would never confront. Like, if I heard, like, my coworkers, like, talking smack about me, I'd be like, okay, I'm gonna go the other way.
No, especially in her position.
Well, I forgot she did just get demoted.
So, she has to maintain, like, a certain, like, even though Elizabeth is badass and she's going around taking people's beakers and, like, doing her thing, right. Like, she also has to, behave herself because she is a woman in a male-dominated world, so she's not just gonna ruffle feathers if she doesn't have to, which I'm assuming she thought she had to when she stole Calvin's beakers. But when she overhears them having this conversation about her, it reminds her of a time in the past where she was also called that awful derogatory term. So back when Elizabeth was in chemistry school. Back when she was a student, she was actually going for her master's degree, and she was almost done. She was only 10 days away from graduating, and she had already been accepted into the doctorate program for chemistry. And so she was in the lab, and she was running test protocols on some of the stuff. So she was running test protocols, and then
was it for, like, a project, like, before graduation?
It was for, like, a lab that they were doing. So they were, like, doing, like, a lab the next day. And so she was preparing. So, like, usually when you do the lab, they're, like, running, like, all of the data, like, through these machines, like, through all these things. So she was running, like, the test protocols to make sure that everything was functioning properly, is what she was trying to do. She thought she had found an error in the test protocol, and she just wanted to make sure that everything was running smoothly for tomorrow's lab. And then she's, like, busy. She's working on stuff. And then all of a sudden somebody comes in, and she looks up, and it's her academic advisor. And she doesn't like him. So he has a history of going through a lot of secretaries, and nobody really knows why, but he can't keep a secretary. And also, one previous time, she had gone into his office, and he had made an advance towards her. So he asked her into his office under false pretenses and said it was about, like, her academic career, and then he made a move on her. He actually stuck his hand up her skirt, and when she got very offended, and she was like, she said, she threatened to report him, and he just said, to whom? Like, nobody would believe her.
Did she try to actually report him? Or?
No, she didn't. She didn't try and report him. So he comes in, and he seems noticeably irritated. He's like, what are you doing? And she's like, well, I'm just rerunning these test protocols to make sure everything's running properly. And he's like, did I ask you to do that? And she's like, well, no, but I found an error. And he's like, but nobody asked you to do this. Why are you undermining my authority by running these tests? And then she's just like, okay, hold up. Like, this is not my plan. And then he asked her if she's alone. He's like, is anybody else here with you? And she's like, no, everybody left. It's just me. And that's when he turns and he locks the door behind him. And he turns to Elizabeth and he smacks her across the face. He just
outright?
Yeah, he just backhands her across the face. And she's just, like, in shock. And then he hits her again. So he smacks her across the face again. And, and he picks her up, and she fell on the floor. So she fell on the floor, she's on the floor, and he's like, somebody needs to teach you a lesson.
But wasn't she going, like, the extra mile by, like, trying to make sure that everything was good to go for, like, the lab the next day?
Yeah, but in his mind, she's saying, by running that test, she's saying that he didn't adequately prepare the lab for tomorrow. So by her saying that there's a error with the lab, that she's directly saying that he is the one who didn't notice it. So in his mind, she's trying to say that he's not adequate at his job. And so but anyways, he picks her up from the ground, he throws her down on the table, And then he said, don't move. See you next Tuesday. And then Elizabeth is struggling. She's trying to get out from underneath him, but he's a 250-pound man that's on top of her. And he actually inserts himself into her. And Elizabeth is scrambling, trying to figure out what to do. And then all of a sudden, he starts screaming. He's like, Jesus Christ! Like what is going on? And then turns, he has a pencil sticking out of his stomach. Elizabeth had managed to grab a pencil with one of her hands and stab him with it. And the only thing you could see was just the little pink eraser sticking out of his abdomen.
Those number 2 like pencils that we had in schools.
Elizabeth had managed to pierce not only his small but also his large intestine.
Good.
She stabbed him. Yeah, I totally agree. And so a cop shows up. The campus police show up, and they show up, and they're like, so, Miss Stott, do you have any remorse for what you did? And she was like, remorse? I need a doctor. And Elizabeth is bleeding at this point. Like, she is hurt because he essayed her. And so she's like, I need a doctor. Yeah. And he's like, so, no, you don't regret what you did. And she's like, regret?
She has charges against him.
Yeah, she's like, regret? What do you mean? And he's just like acting like this is all her fault. And he doesn't even believe that she's a chemistry student there, because why would a woman be studying chemistry? So he actually asked to see her student ID. Yeah. And then she's asking for a doctor, and he's like, no. He's like, do you have any regrets? And she's like, yes, I have a regret. He's like, okay, what is it? And she says, pencils. And he's like, pencils? What do you mean? She's like, pencils. I regret not having more of them. And then she actually gets put in front of the academic board, and she gets taken out of her doctorate program. Yeah, so...
It's like no files were charged against
the
advisor. No R-word kit was ran. Like, can they decline, like, if you ask for, like, an R-word kit to be ran?
Not now, but back then it didn't really matter because nobody was really prosecuting those kinds of cases to begin with. They were really hard to prove, and a lot of the times they just took the man's word for it. And his story was that he had caught Elizabeth cheating, and she threw herself at him, and she was propositioning herself to him. And when he refused, in a fit of anger, she stabbed him with a pencil. That's what he had said.
So he refused and then accidentally fell into her? Like,
yeah.
At least make your story make sense. Like,
and so the academic board, even though he did have a bad reputation, and it pretty much was well known throughout the campus that this guy was someone that women should stay clear of, he had such a high academic standing because he was actually taking all of his students' academic papers and publishing them in science magazines under his own name.
So he's just a shitty human being all around.
Yeah. But because he had been doing that for so many years, in the chemistry community, he is a well-renowned chemist because he has all these academic papers. He must be a smart guy, but none of them are actually his. So the school is so concerned with keeping this, like, high-level chemist that they just let her go. And they give her master's degree, but she's not allowed to come back for her doctorate program.
Would she be able to, like, apply for, like, other schools to do her doctorate program? Or
so back then, women weren't allowed at a lot of schools. They weren't allowed at any of the Ivy League schools. They weren't allowed at Harvard. They weren't allowed at Columbia. There was only certain schools that women were allowed to go to back then. So even if and she never would have been able to get into another school with this in her academic binder anyways, because she also is a woman. So the fact that she even got accepted was kind of a big deal to begin with. And then this happening, there's no way any other school would accept her. If she could even find another school that would take a woman. Her academic career is over. And then, so back to where we were at before. So Elizabeth just got demoted, and so she's really upset about it, and she decides that she's going to take a night for herself, and she's going to go see the show.
Calvin. Sorry.
Yeah, she's just on a roll. She's like, that memory brought it back. I'm just gonna stab him. So she decides that she's going to go to the theater and she's going to watch a play. So she goes to the theater to watch this play, and guess who else happens to be at the theater as well? Calvin Evans. And Calvin Evans is actually there on a date. So Calvin Evans is there on a date, and his date is wearing like some of the stinkiest, like strongest perfume ever. And Calvin is getting extremely nauseous because he just cannot stand the smell of this perfume anymore. It's like getting to him. And so it's like, you know, like Axe body spray kind of a thing. Like it smells so strong he just can't stand it. So he decides that he is going to leave. And so he gets up and he tells the woman, like, I'm sorry, I'm sick, I have to go. And so he's running to it's intermission, he's running to go to the bathroom, and then all of a sudden Elizabeth decides to leave at the same time as well. So Elizabeth decided to leave because she decided she actually didn't like the play. She thought that the play was actually a little bit racist, and it also seemed like they were blaming women for a lot of their problems. And she was like, this is exactly what I was trying to escape from. Sounds a lot like
it's hitting
work.
Too close to home.
Yes. She's like, I gotta go. So she goes to the bathroom, and there's this huge, long line of people, and she's just like, great. I'm not going to wait in this line. So she turns around to leave, and she runs straight in to Calvin Evans. And Calvin Evans just vomits all over her. Yeah.
Bro.
Calvin just vomits all over her. And Elizabeth is like freaking out. She's like, oh my God, I need a doctor. This man is sick. Somebody come quick. And then nobody's paying attention. They're just like, oh, whatever. And then she turns down. She's like, wait a second. Don't I know you? And then that's when she realizes it's Calvin Evans. And she calls him a cab, and she takes him home. So she helps him.
That's nice of her.
Yeah. And so she gets a cab, takes him home. She's walking him up to his doorstep. And then that's when he apologizes. He's like, I'm so sorry. And she's like, oh, it's okay. Like, we're chemists. We understand vomit. Like, it's just a chemical reaction. It's fine. It's not a big deal. He's like, no, I'm sorry for confusing you for a secretary. I'm so sorry that I did that. And then he introduces himself. He's like, we never got properly introduced. I'm Calvin Evans. And then...
She's gonna get her job back? I mean... It's like, your sorry means nothing to me, dude. Like, are you gonna get me promoted? Because I got demoted because of you.
I mean, that technically wasn't his fault. She was the one who went in there and took his speakers.
Well, technically...
She's the one who started it in the first place.
Technically, if he didn't go confront her to apologize, none of them would have known that they were his beakers that she stole. So she wouldn't have gotten demoted because nobody would have known and connected them to Calvin Harris. Is it Harris? Evans? Klein? What is his last name?
Did I say Harris?
I don't know.
It's Calvin Evans.
I just keep thinking of like Calvin Klein whenever you say Calvin.
Yeah, it's definitely Calvin Evans. And so, anyways, they get back to work, and so he leaves. So Elizabeth leaves. She goes home, and then she goes back to work, and they've kind of had like a truce at this point. So they don't hate each other, but they don't know if they really like each other yet either. But they actually start spending time together, and they actually start having lunch together. So one day they're having lunch, and Elizabeth tells him that she had gotten taken off of her project
Because of him.
and put on an easier project. And he's like, and she starts talking to him about it, and he's like, well, why would that happen? And she's like,
I wonder why.
and then she tells him it's because of sexual discrimination. And he's like, what do you mean, sex discrimination? Like, he doesn't even think
Calvin, you're part of the problem for thinking that she's a secretary to begin with.
And then she's just like, sex discrimination. And he's just like, what? And then she's like, yeah. She's like, I got taken off of the job because they didn't think that I was intelligent enough to be on that job. And then she explains to him that she got demoted and that it was also because of the beaker incident and all of that stuff. And then Calvin comes up with an idea. He's like, you know what? I think I can figure out a way to get you back on the research project that you want to be on. And she's like, what do you mean? how can you get me back on the research project? And he's like, well, you know, like I said, Calvin is the top guy, right? So he's like, well, if I tell them that I need your research to help with my research, it's a done deal. They'll do it. And she's like, but I don't want any favors from anybody. She's like, I want to earn it all on my own. No. And he's like, what do you mean? Like, this is you even said it yourself. This is a broken system. Sometimes you have to find other ways to get what you want. And then, so she's like thinking about it.
It was his fault.
And she's like, I don't know, maybe. But she's still not convinced at this point. And he's like, look, I owe you. Once, for calling you a secretary. And then second, for vomiting all over you. And she's like, you know what? I agree. I'll take you up on it. And then they strike a deal. But Elizabeth has one condition. That this is all business. This is all work
Famous
related.
last words.
All work related, and that's it. There's no relationships. She has no interest in dating him. This is all work. And he agrees. He's like, okay, I agree. All work, no relationship. That's not what this is about. So Calvin gets her put back on the team. And then at this point, they start hanging out a lot. So they start having lunch together. They start going out for coffee. They start hanging out, and they have these really in-depth conversations about their work because they're both really well educated and really well established chemists, and they both have their own theories. So they just talk about their own chemistry theories all the time, and they just bounce ideas off of each other, and they're just basically becoming really good work friends. And so they start hanging out all the time. And then Elizabeth and Calvin, so one day they're leaving the office and they go walking out to the parking lot, just the two of them. And so they're in an argument. They're arguing over theory. She thinks she's right. He thinks he's right. They're both trying to prove their point. They're arguing. And then Elizabeth is like, we have a problem. And then she's like, Calvin's like, what? What's the problem? She's like, you're the problem. And she like storms off and goes to her car. And then she just starts thinking, and then Calvin just starts thinking about how he's been on his best behavior and that he should just give her a break because he's been trying his hardest to make sure that she knows they're only in it for work. So whenever they go out to eat, he refuses to pay for her. He will not even open the door for her. One time she had books stacked so high he couldn't even see her face, and he didn't even open the door for her.
I feel like he's just trying not to be a gentleman. Like, you gotta...
Yeah, he's literally trying his hardest to make sure that she knows that he's not trying to be in a relationship. He's not trying to give her anything under false pretenses, even though he's falling for her. He just can't stop thinking about her all the time. He just wants to be around her all the time. But Elizabeth always seems to be in a hurry whenever he's around. And she
fallen for him.
She always seems to be in a hurry. So she always seems to be in a rush to get away. So, Calvin so they're still in their argument. They're still arguing. They're arguing about silkworms. So Elizabeth is trying to propose to him that silkworms help in this chemical reaction to make this thing happen. I'm not going to pretend I know what it is. It's chemistry stuff. But anyways, they're having this argument, and Calvin is just like, oh, great, silkworms? And she's like, oh, you're not interested? And he's like, no, not at all. And so Elizabeth gets mad, and she storms off, and then she starts thinking about it, and she's like, man, this guy, she's like, what are the chances I meet the perfect guy? He's intelligent. He's into the same things I am. We can talk about things for hours. And he's not into me at all. She's like, I don't get it.
She's disappointed?
She's disappointed. And she's like, even that time I had my hands full of books. Like, he wouldn't open the door for me. Yeah. And she's just like, man, he's like evading me at every turn. Like, what is going on? And she's like, every time she's with him, she just gets this like overwhelming feeling like she wants to kiss him because she's falling for him so hard. So whenever she is hanging out with him, she just like runs away. Like whenever it's time to leave because she's scared that she's actually gonna kiss him. So she's like, I can't make the first move. She's like, I gotta get out of here. So she'll just like run away. And so like they're having this conversation. She's like, I gotta go. And he's like, business as usual. And she's just like, ugh. So she just like scuffs off, goes into her car. She's sitting in her car and she's just mad. She is so mad. She's like, just can't understand like why this is happening. And she's like, you know what? I bet you he thinks I'm only in this for the lab equipment. I bet you he thinks I'm just in it for the beakers and I'm just trying to get his lab equipment and that's why he's treating me like this and that he's not interested at all. And she's just so frustrated. And then all of a sudden Calvin comes and he just knocks on her door. She starts banging on her door and she turns and she rolls down her window and she's like, I don't want your lab equipment. And he's like, well, I'm not the problem. And he leans down into her window and she just grabs his face and she kisses him.
She grabs his face and kisses him?
Yeah, she grabs her face and kisses him. And then, of course, after that point, they're pretty much inseparable.
They're an item.
They spend all of their time together. They spend all of their lunches together. And they're just in absolute bliss.
Does it work place now, or do they have to keep that like a secret?
So they know. Everybody knows, and everybody hates it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Everybody pretty much talks crap about them behind their back constantly, all the time. Everybody is literally always watching them. Like, while they're in the cafeteria, people will just be staring at them, and they'll just be, like, watching them and talking about them while they're in the cafeteria. And they're like, oh, I know she's just into him because he's famous, because he's this famous chemist, and that she's not actually interested in him. She couldn't be. Like, look at him. He's hideous. And they're like, I can't believe it. They're like, she didn't take any of my advances, but she's gonna take this guy's. Like, they're all upset, right? Because Elizabeth was one of the most attractive women in this institute. So they're like, of course, Calvin Evans is the one that gets the girl, because they also don't like Calvin, because Calvin, in their minds, is better than everybody else because he's the smartest, he gets the most equipment, he gets his own lab, he gets everything. So everybody just kind of doesn't like him. And also the point that he's kind of a weirdo, so they stay clear of him. They are pretty hot and heavy at this point. They're like spending all of their time together. They're like in absolute bliss. They love each other. They're meshed so well. They stay up all night talking to each other. They're just so happy. And then Thanksgiving comes around and Calvin's like, hey, so he realizes that they have never one time talked about their families. Not once. And he's like, so...
How long is this again into their relationship?
They've been dating now for probably a couple months.
Okay.
Yeah. And then, so he realizes they've never brought up family. And so he asks her, are we going to spend Thanksgiving with your family? And she's like, oh, no. And he's like, what? Why? What do you mean? And she's like, oh, my family's estranged. But she, like, doesn't really get into it. So he pushes on it. He's like, why? What happened? And then he finds out that Elizabeth was actually raised by a preacher. So her dad was a preacher, but not your normal average preacher.
Is this like a cult preacher?
Yeah. Not necessarily like a cult. Yeah, I would say it was pretty cultish. So he would get people to donate money. So he's a scam artist. He wasn't really like a cult leader. He was a scam artist. And he would convince people to donate to his church. And he would perform these miracles. And how he would perform these miracles is, I guess, pistachios are actually very flammable and can make stuff spontaneously combust. So he would use pistachios to, like, make stuff spontaneously combust. She starts telling him about how her dad is this, like, crazy religious fanatic. And, yeah, that's how he convinces people.
Can we go set a pistachio on fire right now?
I mean, we could try it out. Yeah, I think it would be interesting. But so he makes things spontaneously combust with pistachios, and he was actually very good at this. So he was so good to the point where he would get a new car every year. Yeah. And they would leave Elizabeth, so she had a mom too as well, but her mom was kind of like distant. Neither of them really spent a lot of time with her. Her mom was totally into this whole scam, and she was totally supportive of her husband as long as he was bringing home the money. She didn't really care. So she supported him in all of this. And
can you blame a woman? I'm just kidding.
If the money's coming in, who cares?
Right.
No. Her dad and her mom would leave her home like all the time. So Elizabeth actually admits that she pretty much raised herself. So
Makes sense why she's so independent.
yeah, exactly. So she pretty much raised herself, and she didn't even go to school. She learned everything that she knew from reading books at the library. Yeah.
So like Matilda style?
Yeah.
Wow.
And she, eventually, her dad actually ended up getting convicted, and he was now in prison. And then, he's now in prison, and her mom moved to Brazil and got remarried because there's no extradition in Brazil. So she pretty much flew the coop and left the country and is living in Brazil with her new husband, and she has a whole new life, and just like, that's it. Elizabeth doesn't even talk to them anymore at all. And then Calvin also asked her if she had any siblings, and she said yes, that Elizabeth did have one sibling, but he passed away. So he actually self-exited, and Calvin starts asking her what happened and what was going on, and he was actually gay, and his dad was really against it, and his dad would tell him...
The preacher one? The scammy preacher? The
Yeah.
scammy preacher one?
His dad would tell him awful things, that he was going to hell and like eternal damnation. So at 17, he did self-exit, and Elizabeth was only 10 years old. And Elizabeth's brother was her best friend. They did everything together, and also, like, being two kids of parents that were, like, not very present, they leaned on each other a lot. So that really affected Elizabeth a lot, losing her brother like that. And so she held, of course, a lot of animosity towards her parents, and she really loved and cared about her brother.
That's sad.
Yeah. And then she goes to Calvin, and she's like, well, what about your parents? And then that's when Calvin admits that his parents actually died in a train accident. They had gotten hit by a train when he was a little kid, and they passed away. And then Calvin went to go live with his aunt, and shortly after he went to go live with his aunt had a heart attack while driving and ran into a tree and died. And he was there. Yeah.
He was in the car?
He was in the car with her. Yeah, when it happened. And then after that, he was put into an all-boys Catholic school. Yeah, so pretty rough start for both of them. And he also, and then she asked him, like, how was it in the boys' home? And he simply just says, rough. And he says that it's a family curse, that all of his family members die in freak accidents, that it's a family curse. And she's like, well, don't say that. And he's like, well, all my family members have died. So he gets raised in the boys' home, and yeah, so both of them don't have the best upbringings, but they just kind of move past it. Now they know each other's backgrounds, and they still are having their normal everyday relationship. They're still going to work, still doing everything. They are totally in love. So they are hanging out all the time, and they have lunch together every day in the cafeteria. And one day they're talking, and Calvin gets this idea. So he was talking to his friend from Cambridge, because he went to Cambridge. He was talking to his friend about Elizabeth, and the guy's just like, wow, when's the wedding? Like, you guys seem like you're totally in love. And Calvin's like, and then Calvin just gets the idea. He's like, wow, maybe I should propose. So they start having this conversation at the cafeteria, and then Calvin actually asks her to marry him
In the cafeteria?
in the cafeteria in front of all of their coworkers.
No. Like, did he not think it through? I'm sorry, bro. But
I don't know. He's just like spur of the moment. He just like took out the ring and just
Did he
asked
say yes?
her. And she says no. And so she said that they've previously had conversations about this, and he had known that she didn't want to get married. So Elizabeth, unlike most women in the 1950s at this point, did not want to be married. So she especially didn't want to be married to Calvin Evans, because she knew as soon as she got married to Calvin Evans, anything she did after that point when it comes to her job and chemistry and all that stuff wouldn't count for anything. Everybody would just think that he had done it. And her whole thing is she wanted to make a life for herself. She wanted to be her own person, and she wanted to make strides in research and be remembered and be this amazing chemist and make all of these discoveries. And she couldn't do that if she was attached to Calvin Evans.
They talked about that before?
Yeah, they had previous conversations about that before, but he was hoping, because they were so in love, that she would
mind would
marry
just get
him,
changed.
and she would just change her mind.
Oh,
And so he's like, well, what if you kept your name? And then she's like, no, because everyone's still going to know that we're married, and they're
Especially
still...
since he asked her in front of the whole cafeteria.
Yeah, and she's like, no, everyone's still going to call me Mrs. Evans. Everybody's going to think we're married. Like, it's not going to work. And he's like, no, it won't be like that, blah, blah, blah. And then she's like, well, what if you took my name? And he's like, well, I couldn't do that. And she's like, why not? And he's not saying anything. And she's like, why not, Calvin? And then she's like, because you're famous? And he's like, well, yeah. He's like, well, yeah, like, I'm already married.
Admit it. That should be the hill you die on. You never admit that.
And then Calvin is just, like, upset. But, I mean, he's not gonna let this...
Do they break up?
No. So, of course not. He's so in love with her. She's so in love with him. It doesn't matter what happens. I don't think anything would break these two up.
Good.
So, Calvin gets upset, though, and he's like, look, I've just been envisioning this in my mind, like, us getting married and us taking these next steps, and I've always imagined there being 3 of us. And Elizabeth is like, oh, no. Oh, no. Because Elizabeth also does not want to have children. She wants to focus on her career, and she does not want to have any kids. So she's like, oh, what? No way. Like, he does not want to have a kid. And then all of a sudden, he's like, I was hoping we would get a dog. And she's just like, thank God.
Is this where the dog perspective comes in? That you're talking?
Yeah. So they decide that they're going to get a dog. And then the whole cafeteria is talking about them because they're just sick of them. They just can't stand them, eating lunch together every day. And Elizabeth has also, like, been, like, packing their lunches and, like, making him food. So they're all, like, so disgusted. They're
Lasagna, just, perfectly proportioned.
Yeah. And they actually move in together. So they have an agreement. Because Elizabeth was like, oh, I don't know at first. And she's like, I'll pay half the rent. And Calvin, knowing there's no way she can afford to pay half the rent, he's like, well, my bungalow's already paid off. Why don't you just... And then she's like, okay, well, I can make us dinner. I'll agree to make us dinner 5 nights a week. So that's their agreement, is that she'll make them dinner 5 nights a week. She actually ends up making breakfast, lunch, and dinner 5 nights a week. But she loves to cook for him. She loves to cook for Calvin, and she loves to cook. She does it for herself anyways. So she cooks all of their meals.
I feel like everything's going too good right now. I'm like waiting for the other shoe to drop.
And then so they decide they're gonna get a dog, but they haven't started looking yet. So one day Elizabeth's coming home from the grocery store, and she's walking home. And then Calvin is watching her coming up to the door, and he notices there's a dog following her. And then she's got her handful of groceries. She's not really paying attention. She doesn't even know there's a dog behind her. And Calvin is like, hey, who's your friend? And she thinks he asked her for the time. And she's like, oh, it's 6:30. They take the dog in. They give it a bath. Nobody's looking for it. They decide to name the dog 6:30. Because that's what they were trying to, yeah. So they named the dog 6:30. And 6:30 is not your average dog at all. So 6:30 seems to have some sort of, like, heightened intelligence for a dog.
Of course,
and
after
they've had him for a while, they start to notice that he picks stuff up really quickly. And Elizabeth is like, should we be concerned? Like, do you think there's something wrong with him? And he's like, no. He just really wants to please us because we, like, saved his life, you know? And then 6:30, this is where his inner dialogue comes along. 6:30 was actually a bomb-sniffing dog.
What?
Yeah, so 6:30 was a bomb-sniffing dog, but he had gotten abandoned by his owner because he was really bad at it. So he was in Bomb Sniffing Dog Academy, whatever that is. And he is, they don't say what kind of dog he is, but I think he's just like a wire-haired, like, terrier mix. But he's in Bomb Squad with, like, all these, like, German Shepherds. He's, like, tough German Shepherds. And they all are really good at it. But he doesn't like it because if they don't deactivate the bomb, find the bomb on time, they have to, it explodes. So it makes this, like, big, loud noise every time they can't find the bomb on time. So he gets really scared. And he actually starts trying to not find the bomb because he's like, I don't want anything to do with this. Like, I don't want this thing to explode. I'm scared. And they're also trained to throw themselves on top of the bomb if they do.
The dogs are?
Yeah. If it's, like, not deactivated in time. Yeah. Actually, real bomb dogs are trained to do that, yeah, to sacrifice themselves. I didn't know that. Yeah. What? Yeah, it's really sad.
What is them sacrificing themselves gonna do?
Because it'll lessen the blow for everybody else. So, like, whoever, like, if you're standing on top of it, your body takes most of the impact and it doesn't make as big of an explosion.
That's so sad.
I know. Yeah, it's really sad. Yeah, I'm sorry. But it was a part of the book.
Damn.
So, he did not like being a bomb-sniffing dog, but he was really bad at it, so his owner just drove him out to the middle of nowhere and abandoned him.
Aww.
And
6:30.
Yeah, that's where they found him, and they become totally in love with this dog. He ends up being, like, the best dog ever. He's really well behaved. He always sticks to their side. He never leaves them. And Calvin decides he's even going to take the dog to work. And Elizabeth is like, there's no...
Can they do that?
Yeah, that's what Elizabeth said. She's like, there's no dogs at a research lab. And he's like, rules like that only apply to dogs that aren't, like, 6:30. And she's just like, what? And, like, even the work says something about it. So they, like, come to it and they're like, hey, people are starting to complain about your dog. And all Calvin says is, well, no one said anything to me. And then they leave it at that.
That's it? Because Calvin is, like, so important there that they're like, okay, whatever you say, Calvin.
They're like, I guess we got a dog here now, so...
Mascot!
Yeah. And actually, 6:30, like I said, you know, he's not a normal dog. So he's actually mapped out the entire research institute. He knows exactly where Elizabeth works, exactly where Calvin works, the entire building layout. He's got it all memorized. And he's just a really smart dog. One day, they're at home in the morning, and they're just chit-chatting it up, and Calvin is really into fitness, so Calvin is actually doing fitness videos. Is he buff?
Sorry.
They don't really say. They say that he's maintained his physical health, but they don't necessarily say that he's, like, buff.
Sorry, everyone's talking about how hideous he is, so I was just curious, like, is he super buff?
They did say that he maintained his athleticism, so I'm assuming he's, like, a normal, average, like, athletic build. I wouldn't say he's buff, because it's not like he's, like, going to the gym, like, lifting weights all the time. He does, like, back in the day, when people would exercise, a lot of it was, like, aerobics videos.
I was just, like, wondering, like, was it, like, water aerobics?
Yeah, like, it would, not water aerobics necessarily, but it was, like, stuff you'd watch on television. Like, somebody would be there, like, telling you, like, do a sit-up, do a squat.
Like warmers on?
Yeah. Oh my god, what's his name? The guy with the... Oh my god, I can't think of his name. But the guy, he's got the... Okay. One day, I'll remember. Calvin is actually also a rower. That's what he loves to do. He loves to row.
Like boats?
Yep.
Row your boat?
And he was actually on the rowing team in Cambridge. And he actually went to Cambridge because they had one of the best rowing teams in the world. And so he had originally tried to get into Harvard, but they didn't accept him. Okay. So he holds a little bit of
I bet they regret that now.
Yeah, he also holds a little bit of a grudge against them as well. And it's so funny because he didn't want to go to, like, these certain schools because the weather is too many rain. Oh, yeah, it was Washington. He didn't want to go to Washington because he got accepted to the School of Washington. They have a good team, but it rains too much there, so he didn't want to go there. So he's like, oh, well, I got accepted into this school in London. I'll just go there. Not knowing that London is one of the most rainy cities in the world.
He did not do enough research.
No, he didn't. So, but that's Calvin's thing. Calvin loves to row. So Calvin goes 3 days a week to this boathouse and rows his one-person boat 3 days a week. And so he gets this idea. He's like, hey, Elizabeth, you should come with me to go rowing. And she's like, what? Why would I do that? I don't want to do that. That doesn't sound like fun. He gets up every morning. When he gets up to go rowing, he gets up at 4:30 in the morning. And she's like, that's when I'm sleeping. Like, I don't want to go. And he's like, oh, come on. You'll have a good time. Like, you should go. I really think you'll enjoy it. And she's just like, I don't think I will. And she's like, do women even row? And then he's like, are you saying that women can't row? And then that was it. She was...
He threw her argument back at her. Reverse psychology.
That was it. Elizabeth was in on it, and she was like, okay, I'm rowing. I gotta do it now. He said women can't do it. We're doing it. So she ends up starting to go into rowing with him. So she goes with him to the boathouse for the first time. And Calvin is psyched. He's like, yes, like, I'm going to show her all my stuff. And then he gets out this thing. It's called I should have looked it up. It's called an erg, E-R-G. And what it is it's like a fake, and not like a fake, but it's like for exercise. So it's like a rowing machine for exercise to get, like, used to rowing so that you can row. And then so he gets in this machine, and then he just starts rowing. And then he just totally just, like, zones out and gets, like, super into it. He just starts, like, rowing, like, really hard. And, like, he's supposed to be explaining what he's doing so Elizabeth knows what to do. But he's just, like, totally, like, off. So they have 6:30 with them, too. So they both, so her and 6:30 decide to, like, go, like, walk off. And then everybody else comes into the boathouse. So there's actually teams, like rowing teams that work out of this boathouse. So usually it's an 8-person rowing team.
Okay.
And they immediately notice Calvin. And Calvin is in the middle of the boathouse, like in the middle of everybody's way. They can't get through with their boats because he's just there, like rowing in this, like, in this thing. And then they, like, come up to him and they're like, hey, Calvin, like, can you move? And he's just, like, so focused. So he just, like, totally ignores them. And then, like, their, like, coach, like, comes up to him and he, like, starts, like, coaching him. And he's like, come on, you can do it. Like, just starts, like, yelling at him. And then he just starts, like, rowing, like, really, really fast. And Elizabeth is just like, what the heck is going on? And then, yeah, it was so crazy. And then finally he stops. So the guy, like, exhausts him. He's like, wow, you did it. You made it. He's like, now move this thing out of the way. And then everybody just starts like, Calvin, how's it going? Calvin, how you doing? Are you gonna row with us one day? Like, are you gonna finally join our team? Like, all this stuff. And everybody's like, and then Elizabeth knows. She's like, this is just like work. Everybody just freaking idolizes him. And he's obviously the best of the best at rowing. And she's just like laughing to herself. She's just like, of course he's the best at it. And he refuses to row on anybody's team. So he rows by himself on purpose, even though there's teams that he can be on. Because I guess, like, it's just one of those things where he is so good at it that he doesn't think they're up to his speed and would be as
Calvin standard.
Up to Calvin's standard. So he just doesn't join their team. And they all know that that's why he doesn't join. So they're all, like, kind of salty towards him.
So he's stuck up.
Yeah, he's a little stuck up. Actually, probably a lot stuck up. So Elizabeth, they see Elizabeth and they're like, he's like, oh, this is my new rowing partner. And they're like, whoa. What? Calvin's gonna row with somebody? They're like, you must be phenomenal at it. And then she's like, oh no, I've never done it before. And then they were like, oh, she's gonna be a natural. I can already tell. And they all start looking at her and they're like, yeah, she's gonna be really good. Like, they just think because Calvin said she's gonna do it.
That bone structure, she is.
Yeah, they're like, no, she's got it. Like, you could tell. So they go out into the water, the two of them. First thing they do is flip their boat. And they're both in the water. And Elizabeth doesn't tell Calvin, but one of the main reasons why she actually didn't want to row is because she can't swim. So
that's like important to know.
Yeah.
To go on a boat.
So
she can't swim.
Yeah, she can't swim. So
do they have like life vests on? Do they
actually
row?
don't mention that.
Book's over. She drowns.
I think no. But, like, she can't swim, but, like, she can donkey paddle enough to, like, survive. But, yeah, they flipped their boat, like, 3 times. She was terrible at it. And she is extremely frustrated. And they keep trying. They keep going back like a few times. And she is just so frustrated. She's like, why do I want to? She's like, she's so frustrated. But she can't give up because she just can't. It's just not her character. So she keeps trying. And she's like, Calvin, what is it that I'm doing wrong? And he's like, everything. Physics. Yeah, he says everything. He does say that. And she's like, okay, but what particularly I'm doing wrong? He's like, physics. So Elizabeth goes home and she like starts reading all of these like physics books, and they go back the next day and she's actually like way better at it. And he's like, what? They actually made like a whole lap. And then the next day they get back on the boat, and then she flipped it. So I mean, it was kind of a fluke, but she is getting a lot better at it. So back to work, and Dr. Donati actually, so he reveals that he actually has a relationship with Calvin that nobody really knows about. Dr. Donati, who is Elizabeth's boss, so he's the main guy. So he's the one that demoted her.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, I don't know if I introduced him yet, but Dr. Donati is the boss. So, and he also reveals, so he does not like Calvin at all. So he actually met Calvin a really long time ago because he was also a rower, and he used to row for Harvard.
Chemist row?
I don't know. Is it a thing? I think people just rowed back then. Like, people don't really do that anymore. I mean, no, they do. I mean, I'm sure they do. But I just mean, like, not as regularly.
Yeah.
So he was actually a rower as well, and he was on Harvard's team. Mm-hmm. And they had actually made it all the way to London to row against Cambridge. Mm-hmm. And Cambridge won. And it turns out they were all drunk because they had all gone out to the pubs the day before, and they were all drunk. And Calvin just, like, called him out on it because he, like, went to go, like, he had won, and then he went to go talk to them, like, like, give him a handshake or whatever. And then he turns to him, he's like, are you drunk? And he's hated Calvin ever since. So when he saw that Calvin had applied to his institute, he actually gave him one of the lowest offers that he could come up with. Like, he didn't...
Really?
Yeah, he didn't want him to... He didn't even think that he was going to accept it. And then Calvin did accept it. But the only reason Calvin accepted the offer from him was because it was in California and the weather was so nice that he just wanted to live somewhere with nice weather. So he took the job. And so Dr. Donati actually hates Calvin. Like, he cannot stand him because Calvin has everything that he wants. He's an established chemist. He's super smart. Dr. Donati is actually not even that smart. He got his position because he married the granddaughter of the person who owns the company.
So he married into it.
Yeah, he married into it. But, he's not going to tell anybody that. He just acts like he's the best of the best. And he decides that he's going to try and steal Elizabeth away from Calvin.
Like, relationship-wise?
Yeah. He's like, I'm going to take her for myself, even though he's married with, like...
Yeah, he married into the company.
He's married with 3 kids, but he cheats on his wife all the time because everybody does it. Of course, in his mind, that's how he thinks. So he decides he's going to steal Elizabeth away from Calvin. And you know how he thinks he's going to do it?
How?
He's going to demean her, and he's going to start treating her like crap.
And then she's miraculously going to fall in love with him?
And then she's just going to fall in love. I guess it's worked for him before, according to his inner dialogue. But, so he decides...
every time.
Yeah, so he brings Elizabeth into his office, and he takes her off of her research project again. And he tells her...
After she got back on it?
Yeah. And then he tells her again, for the second time, that it's just not up to her intellectual capabilities. And that she needs to be on something more her speed. And that what she's going for is more of a doctorate degree in chemistry. And she only has a master's degree in chemistry. So he demotes her. And Elizabeth, of course, is furious. But she doesn't bring it up to Calvin because she doesn't want him to fix her problems for her.
Right.
So she doesn't tell him anything.
Independent woman.
So she just acts like everything's going on is normal, and Calvin knows. Because Calvin knows everything. He works there, and he's like the head guy, and that's his girlfriend, so of course he knows everything that's going on with her. So he secretly knows. But, he decides he's not going to do anything about it. He's going to be good. He knows Elizabeth wouldn't want him to intervene. So he stomps into Donati's office and he basically threatens to quit. And he tells Dr. Donati that if he doesn't put Elizabeth back on her previous project, that he will leave to one of the other places that is constantly giving him offers to go work at their research institutes. And Dr. Donati is just like totally taken aback. Like he's just like, oh man. And then he has to do it. But he doesn't mention he also just got somebody that came and gave them a big donation just for Elizabeth's work.
Really?
Yeah. So they don't know. So they had gotten something just for abiogenesis, which is Elizabeth's study of field. That's what she wants to research.
What's abiogenesis?
Is abiogenesis. Abiogenesis is actually the study of like evolution
Oh.
and stuff like that. So she wants to work on that.
Sounds more complicated than...
I know, right? It does. But that's basically what it is. And so that's what she's working on. And abiogenesis is more of like a doctorate degree theory. So that's why they're like, oh, this isn't up to your speed, blah, blah, blah. But he actually got a pretty hefty donor that's willing to donate to the Institute for this research. So he's like, yeah, sure, I'll put her back on the project, no problem. Because Elizabeth was the only person that was making any headway within this research project. Everybody else was just kind of like twiddling their thumbs, not really knowing what to do. So he puts her back on the project, and then Calvin leaves, and he's all happy about himself.
He thinks he did something.
And then he meets up with Elizabeth, and Elizabeth is all excited, and she's like, oh, "Did you hear? I got put. I didn't want to discuss it with you because I didn't want to tell you that I had gotten taken off the project, but I actually got put back on the project." And Calvin's like, "Really? Wow, that's great." And she's like, "You didn't have anything to do with this, right?" And he's like, "No, of course not. I would never interfere with your work. I would never do that." So Elizabeth is like,
technically he's not wrong, because really it's because the donor is just coincidentally.
Yeah, basically. So Elizabeth goes back to her, so Elizabeth's back in her normal position. She's happy. She's doing good. And then, Elizabeth, so they're back at home. They're chilling, and she starts talking to Calvin about how he holds grudges against people. And she's like, why does everybody say that you hold these severe grudges against everybody? Like, what is the deal? And she's like, and he's like, oh, I really don't know. Like, I don't hold grudges against anybody. He's like, I would never intentionally try and sabotage somebody. I would never do that. And she's like, really? So you don't hold grudges against anybody? And he's like, nope, nobody. And then he's like, do you have any grudges? And Elizabeth is just sitting there like, she starts counting her fingers about like how many grudges she has against people because she's full of grudges. And then Calvin lied. So Calvin actually does have a grudge, and he's only ever told one person about this grudge before. So, and that was his pen pal that he was writing to.
Wait, he had a pen pal?
Yeah, he had a pen pal, I guess, for like 2 years that he was confide everything in, because Calvin doesn't have a lot of friends. And he wasn't dating anyone, so he didn't really have anybody that he could, like, confide in. So he had this, like, pen pal that he would send letters back and forth with. And he actually thinks back about his one grudge that he has, and it actually all started in the Catholic boys' home that he was in. So he was in a Catholic boys' home, and one day, this mysterious man shows up with a briefcase. He's dressed... He comes up in like a really nice car, and everybody's just like standing up against the fence like, who is it? Because famous people would like go to the orphanage every once in a while, and they would like bring like extravagant gifts or whatever for like PR purposes, and then so they think it's somebody famous. And then the guy meets with the bishop, and then he leaves, and then all of a sudden they start getting all of these really nice things like books, and like biology books, math books, chemistry sets, like all of this stuff. And then Calvin starts getting in trouble because he comes up to them and he's like, hey, my biology book is missing a huge chunk out of it. And they're like, don't worry about that. You should just be happy that you have a biology book. He's like, but evolution is missing. They're at a Catholic Catholic school. Of course, evolution is missing. So they're just tired of Calvin. Calvin is just this little genius just running around saying all this stuff. And then he actually brings... So he has a meeting with the bishop, and the bishop is like, well, this is all your fault. You're the reason we're getting all this stuff. That for some reason they're only donating to us math and science books. And then he was like, this is all your fault. He's like, what do you mean? He's like, this is your father's doing. He's like, what do you mean? You don't even know my father. And he was like, yes. Yes, I do. And he was like, your father isn't who you think it is. Your parents that died in that train accident aren't your parents. You were adopted. And he was like, what? No, that cannot be true. I do not believe you.
Lifetime.
Yeah, and he was like, your mother actually died during childbirth. And he's like, no, I don't believe you. And he's crying at this point. He's like, no, I don't believe you. There's no way. And then he actually brings out her death certificate, but Calvin is like, his eyes are so full of tears that he can't even read it, that he's just like, believes him. And then he said that this mysterious donor who's donating to the Catholic boys' home is actually his father.
What?
And that he pulled his folder on him, showed him the picture, and then he decided he didn't want anything to do with him, and that he was just going to make donations. And he was like, you should be happy because at least your father is donating. Like, most of these kids can't even say that.
He was still rejected. Wait, did he also say how his father found him?
No, he just showed up one day randomly, and then he only seems concerned with, like, his, like, intellectual, like, knowledge. And then he was like, it's probably because you're just a bad kid. He's like, most people are become bad. I think you were born bad. And he just starts talking to Calvin about how awful he is and how he's just such a bad kid, and like, because they can't stand, he's always in trouble. They're constantly like hitting him with like rulers, like against the knuckles, and like punishing him because he is such an outspoken child, and he's like read all of the books in the library, and they're just like, there's no way that could happen. So that was the thing that Calvin had last written to his pen pal about, was about how he wished his father was dead, and his pen pal never responded. So he never heard from his pen pal again. And Calvin...
His pen pal is dead?
I don't know.
Okay, sounds sus.
And then, yeah, so that was Calvin's grudge. One morning, so they're getting ready to leave, and then Elizabeth can't sleep. So their rowing had actually gotten canceled for the day because it was raining outside. So they didn't get to go rowing in the morning, because sometimes they go rowing. Yeah, they usually go rowing before work, and Elizabeth is actually kind of excited. She's like, thank God. She's like, yes, I get to sleep in. She's like, I don't have to go. And so she gets up, though. She gets up at 4:30, and he's like, hey, we don't have to row today. Like, what are you doing up? And she's like, oh, well, I was just going to go into work early because I can't sleep. Because she's used to getting up at 4:30. I get it. You get into a routine. And he's like, okay, well, just give me a few minutes and I'll go to work with you. And she's like, no, stay and sleep. I'm going to put the potato casserole from last night into the oven, and you can have it for breakfast when you wake up. So she does that. She kisses him goodbye, and she leaves. And Calvin goes to go on his... Oh, I forgot to mention. So Calvin not only does those aerobics videos, he's actually also a runner. So he runs.
I hate running too.
Yeah.
Like, I don't like chemistry. I don't like...
We went nothing in common with these people. So he's a runner. And back then, in the 1950s, I guess it wasn't very popular to run outside.
Oh, really?
Most people did their running like on like an indoor track. Or like they didn't like just run down the street. So everybody thought it was really weird when Calvin did that. Mm-hmm. So he would get like the cops called on him, like all the time, regularly actually. And the cops actually like started getting like used to it. So they're just like, oh, that's just Calvin Evans. Like, don't worry about it. Like, he's just he doesn't like to run in place like everybody else, because that's what everybody used to do. They used to like run in place. So they're like, he just doesn't like to run in place just like everybody else. So Calvin goes to go on his morning run. He decides he's actually going to run to work, and he's going to take 6:30 with him. So him and Elizabeth has had this conversation the day before that 6:30 actually needs to start wearing a leash now, because 6:30 is they just did all of these leash laws. So back then, they didn't have any leash laws at all. You just have your dog running around doing whatever they want. And they had just done these leash laws. So now it was the law that you had to have your dog on a leash. So Calvin, remembering, goes to grab the leash and puts it on 6:30 and then goes to walk out the door. And then 37 minutes later, he was dead.
What?
And that's where we're going to leave off.
No, are you serious?
Part 1 of Lessons in Chemistry, and we'll see you back next time for part 2.
What a cliffhanger to leave us off at. What?
Yep.
Is it the casserole? Is it the killer casserole?
No, it's nothing to do with the casserole, that's for sure.
Oh, I thought like maybe he like left it in the oven, like slept past it, and then the house burned down. Okay, no, okay.
No. No, he ate the casserole, put it back in the fridge. The casserole was not the culprit.
Damn.
Next
Calvin
week.
dies?
Yep. And that's exactly, so I'm telling you guys exactly how it was written in the book because that's exactly how the chapter ends. It literally says, and 37 minutes later, Calvin was dead. Like, what? Okay, so, yep, that's how we're leaving you. So you guys are just going to have to wait until next time, and we'll get into what happened to Calvin Evans, and also what Elizabeth goes through without him as well. So, we'll see you back next week for the next part of Lessons in Chemistry. Bye!
I can't believe you left us off at that. So mean.
Is that bad?
No,
Should I
it's
not have
good.
done that?
No, it's
Okay.
good. It's good. I'm just.
I don't know. I feel like
Is Calvin Madeline's baby daddy?
yeah.
You must have to tell me.
Oh no. I lied. No.